Our speaker today is Dr. Marisol Garcia-Reyes. She is a principal scientist at the Farallon Institute in Petaluma, which is a nonprofit scientific organization dedicated to understanding and preservation of healthy marine ecosystems. Marisol has a background in physics and atmospheric science, but she's an oceanographer at heart. She earned a Bachelor of Science in Physics at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico in Mexico City before moving to California to pursue a PhD in atmospheric science at UC Davis, where she completed her dissertation on the variability of coastal upwelling in California in Dr. John Largier's lab. Marisol has studied coastal upwelling for over 10 years, focusing on its variability, how it relates to climate, and how it impacts marine ecosystems. Her current research focuses in two areas: how climate is and will impact conditions of organisms such as fisheries in the California current and zooplankton communities in the Gulf of Alaska, and how climate is impacting the occurrence of marine and terrestrial extreme events. Marisol also maintains the multivariate ocean climate indicator for California. She's also a mentor committed to increasing equity in education for people of color and increasing diversity in sciences. Her talk today is titled Changes in the California Coastal Upwelling System in Recent Decades. And so without further ado, Dr. Marisol Garcia-Reyes.
That sounds like a completely different person, but thank you for having me and thank you for inviting me back. I'm gonna present something that many of you have heard before. Hopefully there's some new things, but I see new faces. Thank you for staying and coming. So for you, I'm gonna start talking, but I just wanted to acknowledge that this has been a long time of work and collaboration with John Largier, obviously, because he was my advisor, with other people that I mentioned through the presentation, but also Bill Seidemann, and more recently, Gammon Koval, which all this work has been many years in the making. And thank you for all of them. Oh, now how can I move? There you go. So as Nick said, I was a grad student here, actually. I mean, I was officially part of the atmospheric science, but I was oceanography at heart, and John was very nice to accept me as his grad student. So I was a grad student here at BML, so it's great to come back every time that I come back and talk to you. This is my committee, John, who's my advisor, Bill Seidemann, who is actually my boss now, and Ian Faluna, which was the more terrifying and more entertaining class that I ever had in atmospheric science. And so they were great all through my grad school years. So as Nick said, I studied coastal upwelling as a grad student, partially because it's part of like winds. We'll talk about that, but that's why I came into atmospheric science. I kind of wanted climate, but I did my dissertation in Mexico on coastal upwelling. Just because I thought it was fascinating. And I was just starting to learn a little bit. And then as a grad student, my three chapters of my dissertation were in upwelling. And I'll talk a little bit about one of them, but basically it was how upwelling changes into many different scales and what are the effects on the marine ecosystem. And so that's been actually my first and long-lasting love in research. And of course, not that you didn't see it from the title, but I'm gonna go talk about coastal upwelling, which is what I always talk about. So many of you already know everything that you need to know about this, but for the new ones, I'll just do a very brief explanation. Coastal upwelling is a whole process. When I was a student, I thought it was just the winds and the ocean, but it's actually a very big process. But the basics are winds from the north along the California current or along the California coast come from the north along shore, and they sort of push the water along, the surface water along. And because we are in a rotating system and rotating planet, this creates this forest that is Coriolis, that what it does is actually that water that gets pushed along, it kind of reflects towards the right, which in our system, in our coast, means offshore. And so that water that starts moving offshore has to be replaced from somewhere, because otherwise we'll have void, and that water comes from the bottom, right? That's where the name upwelling comes from. And that has many, many implications for the whole ecosystem. But coastal upwelling, as I say, it's like much more than that, right? It sets a whole ecosystem and a whole set of things, and it's really related to everything. I mean, this graph it's great. I mean, it shows that part of the upwelling is not just water, but also it brings nutrients towards the surface, towards the area of the ocean that has light, so things can grow. And then that end up fueling phytoplankton blooms and feeding like higher trophic levels, both on the ocean, and then there are some implications for the land as well. But to me, I mean, I'm not a biologist, even that I work with many of them, but to me, what I really like about upwelling is how it really connects to everything in this ecosystem. It definitely connects to the climate because of how the winds are set and the atmospheric pattern that create these winds. It really relates and changes the temperature of the water, the pattern, the stratification, the coastal weather, because we have this upwelling of cold water that set of like the fog and how cold the coastal environment is here. And that's how it also affects the marine, I mean, the terrestrial ecosystems. It has to do with topography and geography, which I love. I just love maps, and it has a lot to do with how it channels the winds. But also, I mean, I'm not going to talk about a lot of the characteristics, but this deep water that comes to the surface, it's nutritious, it's cold, but it also has a little bit lower oxygen than other more surface water, lower pH, and so higher salinity. So it has a lot of different characteristics that affects the ecosystem in many different ways. I'm not going to talk about that. It definitely affects currents, is affected by the land runoff, and in that sense affect currents as well. And as I say, it also relates, or it's brought about by the rotation of our world, which sometimes we don't think about it as much, but it's the implications that we live in around in a rotating world, which I think is very cool. So there's so many aspects to upwelling, so that's why I have never been tired of it in my career. But as I say, when I came to Davis, I really wanted to do climate. It was sort of the new thing. I wanted to do climate models and all that, but very quickly I keep falling into upwelling. So part of it is because upwelling really has to do a lot with climate. And this is an image that probably you've seen several versions of it, and this is just temperature, sea surface temperature for many decades in this case. But the important thing, and I don't know if you can see my cursor actually, is that nearby or California current and other eastern boundary upwelling regions, the water is colder near these boundaries. And this is basically due to the winds, right? And those are the same winds that cause upwelling. This is a little bit of a different map. This is showing the sea level atmospheric pressure, right? These patterns in the atmosphere that cause these winds. And so these red colors are higher pressure, and well, the blue, which is, it's very tame in other places, but here is more visible, is the low pressure system. These are the same that you hear in the TV when we're talking about weather, right? It's no storms, but basically they have these gigantic high pressure systems in the middle of the ocean, in like mid latitudes. That is due to circulation of the atmosphere, like on a global scales. And because we are rotating, there are these circles, right, of high pressure systems, and winds go around them. And that's what generates these winds that end up causing upwelling in the eastern boundaries of the continent. And those winds like push the currents, but also generate upwelling. So that's how it gets related to the global climate. And that's partially why I really like upwelling. But I'm just gonna talk about change. And so very quickly, I'm gonna talk about future of upwelling, what it's our current understanding of it, before jumping into what's happening in the last few decades. But so the models of climate, which is, as I say, what initially I came to do and I was more interested in, what they really are predicting, and this is the previous version, the CMIP 6 global climate models, are predicting that in terms of wind, that wind that drives upwelling, it's going to change along the coast differently. More, like it's going to increase a little bit more, which are this red dots over there in the poleward areas of the eastern boundary currents, and it's going to decrease more into the equatorward areas. The blue one is decreasing winds. So we'll have this differential change in winds. So more upwelling in the northern areas or poleward areas and less upwelling in the equatorward areas. Kind of except in the California current, with the blue indicates that is weaker winds pretty much all around. On the other hand, we have the models telling us that in these areas, like the current eastern boundary current areas, temperature, as everywhere else in the ocean, they're going to keep increasing, right? Maybe at different rates, but they're going to keep increasing with the models. And these are the most recent set of models, and they've been investigated thoroughly. So really, in all these east boundary upwelling systems, what the future brings or what the future is for upwelling, it depends on two things. The changes in the winds that, as I say, they're differential in different places, and how much of that temperature changes already. Because the higher the temperature, the more the stratification, harder to bring water from the depth, and especially to bring those nutrients, right? And so even if we are in an upwelling world, we're affected by what happened in the water all around us. But of course, and this is what I learned as through being a student and the beginning of my career, is that these models are not perfect. They are really not Earth system. They are not meant to be. They are not meant to simulate every single process, and especially the small scale processes that affect our world. And one of those is upwelling. The other is like have problems with accuracy or with resolution, just because they are meant to be global models. And what we want to know from these models is what happened when we increase CO2. They are not meant to reproduce the Earth as it is. So we need to take these models with a grain of salt and sort of as a guidance of what could happen. But there are many other details that we need to actually look around or look into. And that's something that I learned as a student, and then I went back to the data. But anyway, let me just summarize by saying that in the California current, the models are actually saying that the winds are going to decrease. So they're going to be weaker, so less upwelling winds, and also that the temperature is going to continue increasing. But knowing this about the models, I actually wanted to go back to the data. And although once in a while I look at the models, I remained with the data. There's a lot of it. And for the ecosystem and for us, we really want to know what's happening now, what it's really the data telling us rather than models that we don't know how accurate they are for our system, right? For other things might be better. So let's talk a little bit about our situation now or in the last few decades, which is the title of my title. So this is a map of temperature in the California current. Say this is sort of the upwelling season or a cut of the upwelling season from March to July. And the arrows indicate the wind, also the climatology of the wind. And what we can see is that we have this tongue of cold water near the shore, which signals that we have upwelling, right? That upwelling is bringing, or those very strong winds at the coast are bringing deep water, cold water to the surface. And you can see it at these scales, which is larger scale. Except maybe in the Southern California current, which the waters are much warmer, and it's hard to see it here, but the winds are slightly weaker, particularly in the Southern California bight, right? But you can see that there's a big difference between the coastal temperature and the offshore temperature. Even if we are within the California current, which is a cold current, there's still a very big difference between what you see at the coast, the temperature that you see at the coast, and the temperature that you see offshore. And of course, there's a very big gradient in latitude, even if we are bringing this cold water constantly, at least during the season, to the coast, right? So California has many different temperatures and different configurations. So let me start talking about something that I did as a student here. This was my first chapter of my dissertation and my first paper. And Apology for the very blurry images, but as a student, I really didn't have an idea what was I doing. And so they didn't look great, but it is what it is. It was my first pancake. So what I did in this paper is I was looking into the data. I look into the buoy data that we have, a set of buoys, sort of what is 30 miles from here, from shore, and they are collecting data. And at some point, as a student, I was like, well, there's all this data for almost 30 years. And I felt like they were underutilized, and they could tell us some interesting things about how upwelling was changing, right? So that's what I actually did through my entire student period, look at this buoy data. And so one of the first results that I found is that with this, we saw some trends, linear trends in how these winds and the temperature at these buoys were changing. And that sort of resonated with these ideas that were running around at that time about upwelling changing with climate change. So I decided to investigate a little bit more, and that's the results that I got. And these are the locations of the buoys in this map, right? They're in different numbers. Those are all the buoys that have long-term data sets, or at least almost 30 years. And then in the middle, we have this plot that shows the trends. And so this blue line is showing the alongshore wind, which is what it causes upwelling, and is the trend per year. And so negative means that they are actually getting stronger because the winds go towards the equator, right? The winds are in direction negative. And so the negative trend means they are getting stronger. I know it's a bit confusing. I confused myself for years about this, but that was the main result, that you can see that in the core of this area, the central California, central, a little bit north, the wind seems to be increasing in strength, at least for this period. But then when you move towards the Southern California, that actually the other side, right? They seem to be weakening a little bit. And so that was a big splash in many years, and there have been many follow-up studies about this, but I kind of was curious what's happening now when I updated this, and Gammon, which is here, he did this calculation for me now. And now that's the updated data set. Right now, we extended the time series all the way to 2023. So we added another bunch of years. Now it's like 40 years of data, which I don't know if it has credibility, but at least it filters out a lot of the decadal variability that we have in this season. And it definitely, you see that there's trends are very different, right? Like now they're definitely closer to zero. They are still sort of in the negative side, but they are really not significant. So what we're seeing is that for most locations, actually the wind is not changing very much. There are two locations that are marked with the little asterisk on the right. Those are actually significant trends in the winds, that they are strengthening it a little bit. And so there's still some strengthening of the winds, but once you consider 40 years, they are not changing as much as we thought back in 2010, but still seeing some change. Interestingly, the Southern California buoy, which is all the way down there, which is really not in the upwelling area, it's kind of in a shadow, but it still have some winds. They actually still seeing weakening of the upwelling winds, which is consistent with what we saw before. So that's the update on the winds, but there's more that meets the eye. I mean, at that point, I was just looking at buoys, and that was the data we have. And actually, a lot of the criticism for this paper was it's a very short time period to actually see any trends. But now, I mean, we updated it to 40 years, is a little bit more, but also we have much more data to analyze trends. One of them are satellite data, but especially all the reanalysis and modeling data that use satellite data to actually make more spatial distributions, and we can now analyze the data with a little bit more detail. So these are monthly maps of trends in winds. You kind of see everything blue in there, but That's because of the trends are really, really small. There's a little bit of change in the winds, but it's minimal. And I mean, you cannot see it probably from here, but in Central California, there's a slight and non-statistically significant increase in the winds. And maybe in the southern bay, somewhere in June, which is this middle here, panel over here, there's a decrease in the winds. But this is what happened in the upwelling season. But when we look at the whole year, now that we have a lot of data, what we can see is that February actually has a strong increase in the winds. What it's showing is that in the central and the northern part of the California current, we actually see an increase in the winds. However, it is very early and almost in a time that we don't think about an upwelling season, or very much the beginning of the upwelling season. And probably that's why we see a very big change in the winds. So there's more complications in there. But then the other parameter that I saw, and that is maybe more important for a lot of the organisms, is temperature. And so one other part of that paper was to analyze the trends in the temperature, which now I see in the red line. And what we can see in that paper in 2010, it was also mostly negative trends in temperature. So meaning that the temperature at the buoys was cooling for that period of time that we analyzed, except very much in the north and very much in the south, which the trends were pretty much zero. Now, updating that analysis to now, we can see that, again, the trends kind of flatten, right? Because now we have more data. We don't have those big oscillations from the Pacific decadal oscillation on a lot of El Niños, but still, we have, even if they're not exactly significant, the trends are sort of negative. So somewhere in the northern part of the California area, and going towards positive in the southern part of the California current. However, these are way less negative even than the winds. Really, if we get strict in terms of statistics, there's no changing in the temperatures in the buoys for all this period. But again, things are never simple. There's more than meets the eye. So here is the same plot in the middle. Sorry, here. But then, I mean, if we look at the shore, right? Like the buoys, as I say, they're like 30 miles offshore. But if we look at the shore, the data is slightly different, but still not necessarily significantly changing year round. This is an analysis that we did for the California Climate Indicators release. I mean, the state has they put out a bunch of different climate indicators to see how they change it. They are marine and terrestrial, and so they wanted to know how the temperatures were changing. And so this is year round. Now that is January to December, and what we see in this plot is the same. Is the trends negative to the left and positive to the right, but most of them are actually not statistically significant anyway. So meaning that temperatures are not changing, even if there's some nuance, except in Southern California, which we see here in these red stars. In Southern California, temperatures are definitely increasing. And this is data which is from the optimal interpolation sea surface temperature data set, which are, like 25 kilometers. So it's really not that coastal. But also there are some shore stations, which are marked there by Trinidad Bay, Pacific Cove, and La Jolla. And you can see that those data that is from the shore, in general, is more or less consistent with what's happening in the north. The trends are right there, except in La Jolla, that seems to be warming way faster than any product can tell us, right? So definitely in the Southern California, we have a lot of warming. And then we can also see it from a more spatial perspective. And this is a map of March to July trends. Again, using this optimal interpolation, sea surface temperature. And you can see basically that near the shore or in the coastal areas, except in Southern California, we have bluish color, which means a little bit of cooling, right? And everything that is reddish, it's more warming. However, none of these are very statistically significant except for this cooling over here, right? So even if we can see some changes and some structure in space and obviously in time, what we have is not a very changing temperature in the ocean, at least in the surface, which is very interesting in a world that is warming very quickly. And we can see it every day in the news. So just to summarize this, in the last 4 decades, what we're seeing is that, yes, we have some increase in the winds, although it's not as strong as we saw it before. But we do have it in the northern, in the central part of the California, and it's early in the year. But we do not see a change in the temperature, at least in year-round, when we consider year-round, and in the upwelling season, except the difference is in Southern California when we do see a strong warming, right? And so they, more than ever, it's very clear that they are 2 different systems and different process in the Central and Northern California and in the South. Now let me move a little bit more. Now there's more data that we have on Robo's students. So there are more to see just than winds and temperatures. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about a couple of them. One of them is this index that NOAA produced, that is the Biological Effective Upwelling Transport Index, which is a mouthful, but they shorten it as BEAUTY. And BEAUTY, really what it is an index of how much nutrients are being upwelled, right? So it depends on the winds, and it depends also in the temperature, because the higher the temperature, the less nutrients you have, by different process that I'm not really going to talk about. But what they're finding, and they don't have a long record, this is 88 to 2021 right now. What we're seeing is that actually the amount of nutrients that are coming to the surface through upwelling is not changing. Again, this is a map of, a plot of trends. And what it's showing is that all these red ones are significantly increasing in how much nutrients are they bringing to the surface for this period, right? And we don't see anything negative, even if the Southern California, when there's a little warming and there's pretty much no change. So what they're finding is, or we find with this plot, and again, it's in the indicators of the climate change, is that because of this early upwelling, and especially because it's more in northern areas when are not warming up, we still have a lot of nutrients coming up, right? And that's a good thing for many organisms, but also it could be a bad thing for haves, for example, right? Because those are definitely feeding on a lot of the nutrients that are coming from upwelling. Another way to look at this is by the footprint of upwelling, which, I mean, we say that upwelling is bringing cold water, but then it's transported offshore, and it generates this area of cool water that can be seen from space, and that's what we're seeing when we're looking at big maps, right? All tendrils of cold water that keeps moving offshore. So Santora, Jairo Santora and their group, they did this index, what they call habitat compression index, and so they kind of calculated a temperature that indicates upwelling, right, for our system, and say all the area that has temperature below this threshold, what we're calling temperature of upwelling water, we're going to consider that is the habitat of upwelling, right? And they did this index for California and related to some biological indicators. But what they found is when this area is big, when it's not compressed, I mean, things tend to be very productive, right? We have a lot of upwelling, so we have a lot of food, and everybody can kind of feed around and spread around because it's a very big area. When it's compressed, meaning when there's warmer temperatures, and then we only have a little bit of a area with cold temperatures, what happens is that first there's less food, but also there's less upwelling habitat, and so things tend to compress, and that's when conflicts start to happen. And in particularly, Jairo Santora, what he did is compare it to when we have whale entanglements. And his explanation for this is that when there's a compression in this upwelling habitat, then everybody's trying to feed in the same place, right? And the whales are trying to feed at the same place when we have the crab pots, right? And everybody's at the same place, and therefore we have more entanglements. Since then, they have advanced their work, and they have shown that it's not only the whales and the crabs, but there are other organisms that they can compress in this upwelling footprint, or at least in these areas when we do have more nutrients and cooler temperatures. So it seems like a very good indicator. So we decided to extend it to other upwelling areas and also do it in satellite data. So we define a similar index that we're calling a footprint, upwelling footprint, looking at some temperature that reflects the upwelling. And this is a map of the Benguela, but because we did it for all 4 eastern boundary currents, but it's the same idea, right? We have areas of temperature that are cool enough to call upwelling, and then we see how much they change in time. And so for the California, in this case, we're going to move into the last 2 decades only, because that's where the satellite data is very high resolution to be able to do this. So we define 3 different areas, the Poleward, the Central, and the Equatorial California. And we look at this extent of cool water, how much is changing through time. And just to show you here, in comparison, these are the year-round wind trends. And again, we see that increasing of wind in these 2 last decades. So we have more upwelling in this area for these 2 decades. But what is showing you in this, again, the trends, and this is in the extension of this upwelling footprint. And what we see for the Poleward and the Central areas is that they're not really changing. I mean, they are kind of in the negative side, but they are not significantly changing, right? They are mostly remaining the same. However, for Southern California, as you will expect, since I've been saying it's warming up, definitely this area of cool water is compressing a lot, significantly compressing. So things are definitely changing for this area. And then we look at it also seasonally, because as we have seen, we definitely have experienced some warming. So what is that warming happening? And so the last plot is the same analysis, the same trends on how much the upwelling footprint is increasing or decreasing by region, but also by season, right? And the first 4, the color is the seasons, and each of the kind of sets is each of the regions, Polar, Central, and Equatorial. And you see in the polar region, the most northern region, things are not really changing. The fall is changing a little bit. Then you go to the Central and they are changing more. They're a little bit compressing, but then there's this weird spring point. And then this is Southern California, which is compressing a little bit, but then really, really decreasing in size, right? But you can see 2 things. One is a pattern going from poleward to southern that is like definitely compressing towards the south. But the other thing is that the summer and the fall that are the ones that are compressing the most, right? And that's not what we tend to think about upwelling season. It's just the kind of the post-welling, upwelling season. But that time is actually compressing a lot. Like that remnants of cold water or remnant of welling that we have in this time is not enough to keep this water cool in a way. The interesting point is this one, the spring for the Central California area, which is where we are, which is not changing. And actually, it's like the most zero of all of them. Seems very weird. So we investigate a little bit more and we just look at the maps. Now by season, these are trends in sea surface temperature, just to see where is this compression coming up. I mean, we know that it's coming from warming of the temperatures around the coast, but we wanted to see where it really is happening. And each of the panel is one of the seasons. And you can see winter, yes, we have patches, like the big red is the significant changes. I mean, everything is kind of reddish, but there are significant patches of warming, although not enough to tell us that the upwelling footprint, which in this time is really not that much upwelling, is really just winter happening. And then we see that in the fall, like things are warming really badly everywhere, right? Not just the Southern California, but everywhere. And it's kind of more towards the coast, which is interesting because if we look at annual trends, are really not happening, right? We don't see it when we look at the annual trend. And that's because in the spring, even if we do not have significant trends, what we're seeing is a little bit of cooling, right? And this is where upwelling is happening really strongly. And therefore we still have this very cooling water that is coming from below. And just as reference, I put there again March of July trend in the winds, and that's the time that is increasing a lot in this area, the same area that we still see a lot of upwelling. And I saw a couple of raised hands, so I don't know if I just keep going. So let me just summarize this. So in the last 2 decades, and this is switching a little bit, it's shorter period again, we do see that there's an increase now in the coastal SST, right? That we don't see in the annual trends, but we see it mostly in the summer and the fall. So it's not affecting the time of upwelling, but it's affecting the post-upwelling when there's relaxation, and they're in general, they tend to be warm anyways, right? And we see a larger increases in Southern California. This is at the same time, we have some increasing in the winds in the northern, in the central California current, which interestingly go against what the climate models predicted. So that's why we need to take them with a grain of salt. But good news for us, we have more upwelling at least at the beginning of the year. But really, what's happening is that the upwelling season, it's still there. It seems to be getting stronger winds, and at least it's been able to sort of counteract the warming that we see offshore, right? And so at least upwelling is helping us to keep this warming that we see everywhere and in the summer at bay. But of course, it depends on where we are looking at it. I'm going to skip this because of time. I was going to talk about marine heat waves, but I'm sure you have heard a lot of it. And really, the take at home is that upwelling keeps this at bay. Even if we have them, still upwelling is helping to keep them at bay. So we do see change, and I'm not going to keep going and summarizing this, but it really depends on where we're looking and when are we looking, right? In terms of seasonality and in terms of what are the different areas of the California current, but also if it's near shore or offshore, right? Upwelling makes this band of cold water that is very stable, but during the spring mostly, or spring and early summer. But the rest of the time it's changing, and I feel like sometimes we really need to consider that when we look at organisms. The timing is very important, the location is very important, and sometimes large-scale indicators do not tell us those details. So I'm gonna stop there in the information, but I just wanted to say something else about my work, in the sense that not everything's upwelling. I'm aware of that. And really, my work is focused on how climate and ocean conditions influence the marine ecosystem, either to set them up or to influence change. And so I just wanted to highlight some collaborations that I have done with BML, obviously with John because he was my advisor, but there have been others. I mean, as Nick said, we are doing this multivariate ocean climate indicators with John, obviously. But then we have that very cool paper with Eric and Jackie about the blob and how it affects the biota here. Lauren was not a student here when we did this paper, but now she's actually a postdoc here. And so with Lauren Ashlock, we have this paper about copepods in Alaska, so it's not upwelling. And more recently with Laura Rogers Bennett talking about kelp and how ocean conditions affect kelp. So been collaborating with BML, but one of the opportunities to be here is I would love to collaborate more with BML. I mean, I do the ocean part always, but I'm really interested in how this affects the marine ecosystem. So I'm always looking for new organisms and new aspect to study and see how the ocean and climate impact. And so now I'm happy to hear some questions. Thank you. I'll let you moderate because I don't know, I see hands,
Yeah.
but
So since our audio system is not working, anyone in the audience at BML has questions, raise your hand and call on you. If you can repeat their question,
I'll try.
summarize at least, just so the audience on Zoom can hear. And then for those on Zoom, I'll type this in the chat. Please type messages into Q&A or the chat, and we'll try to address them. So,
Cool.
Well,
So I noticed on like a couple of the temperature maps, especially the one from 2013, where it was like the high resolution line. And then there's like when you have the different maps, winter, fall, spring, stuff.
Yeah.
Like the larger anomalies are like right in front of Russian River, actually. And so I was wondering, kind of like data collection, how much you have to account for like outflow, freshwater outflow, make sure it's not like skewing the data. Like, is that something that could be possibly skewing the data, short term data extent that would get like parsed out?
I mean, it's possible this is satellite data. So if you really want to zoom in, you probably have to. But I mean, in general, it's very well validated and it's very good.
Yeah.
But this data, I mean, this is the highest resolution data we have, but it's known to actually have a bias in upwelling system. And it actually is warmer in a upwelling system than anywhere else. And so you're probably right, like depends what you want to use it for. And for interannual variability or daily variability, you might want to compare it. I agree that in very strong upwelling or very dynamic areas, it does have some biases. So, yep.
yeah, same.
Well, Mark, so really awesome to hear things. But I wanted to ask you about ways actually. So feel free to talk about whatever you might talk about at the beginning before you skip them. But I was also curious whether the trends in these are like flattening the sea surface temperature declines and wind increases. Could you explain the fact that you're including a lot of anomalous years with a lot of the
Yeah. Sorry for Sim, I didn't repeat the other question. I totally forgot. But this one is if the flattening of the trends can be explained by anomalous years in wind or I'm sure temperature. And yes, I mean, that's part of it. And I mean, I kind of said, right, like the more years you have, the more the noise or the decadal variability gets flattened out. And that's the idea of having long-term trends. So actually, I think it's the other way around, that the initial analysis have those initial years that were really weaker winds and high temperatures or different temperatures because there was a lot of El Niños happening. Right now, I'm not that concerned about it because the blob has changed things a lot. Like, yes, if I did the analysis up to 17 or 18, yes, the blob will have a gigantic effect on everything. But enough years have passed that I'm not super concerned about it. And I'm just gonna show this plot really quickly. This is anomalies of temperature in Southern California. And yes, for this, for example, you can see that the trend, like you can see that the increase in temperatures, for example, it's very skewed towards the end, but it's not the same for everywhere else. More towards Northern California, temperatures have come back a little bit, at least for part of the year, towards more normal. So that anomalous years are not as significant as they used to be. And in terms of temperatures, there's a lot of variability. And so, yes, there's some anomalous years, but we've been having few more normal years in terms of wind. So I don't think that that's askew, but in terms of how they're flattened, yes, the more years I think that we have teased out apart at least like the Pacific decadal oscillation, for example, which is a big change. So now I'm more confident that those trends are more related to global, or I mean more big regional processes than before.
Good. It was interesting to see the changes in wind when you broke it down by month. And February was just so strikingly different from everything else. I'm wondering if you have any insights into why February is showing such a dramatic change.
I have not looked at it very in depth, but I think it has to do with the warming and how the system. I didn't get into the details of how these winds are driven, but also how the models show that they are changing, because actually the models do show that the main change in the winds is going to be early in the year. And this is mostly because of the circulation having the most change at the beginning. The warming is it's causing this weather patterns to change a lot, especially at the beginning, right? And so I think that's what it's coming from, that that is the time that it was a little bit chaotic wind for us, but now the warming is making it to be more structured and more a longshore wind, consistently a longshore winds. Oh, and again, I didn't answer I didn't say the question. I'm so sorry. How, like, why there's a change in the beginning for the winds? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You need to remind me.
Yeah, Lucas.
How do you do the recommendation in this environment here and the patterns of the high pressure set? It's not the same thing.
Yeah.
And how it correlates with changes in the onset of the upwelling system. Are we getting upwelling earlier in the year? That's what we like February, very high.
Yes, the question is if I have a look at the relationship of the winds with the high pressure system, and it has to do with that early upwelling. I did before, I mean, not with this very updated data. Definitely the winds are very related to the high pressure system most of the year because that's the driver. It's obviously more important during the winter, just because whatever's happening on land is not as important during the winter. However, towards the upwelling season, actually not the upwelling season, towards the summer, the land becomes more important because it warms up, generates a low pressure system, and that strengthens the winds a lot. So it kind of helps to make the winds more important. So I did study this, and that was actually the first hypothesis from Bakun about how climate change was going to impact the winds, that there was going to be changes in this high pressure system, low pressure system gradient. But it seems like this changes and it's a shift, that's what I want to say, shift poleward of that high pressure system that is causing these changes in the winds, in where they are located and in the timing. And this is a very robust result from climate change, that these high pressure systems are going to start migrating poleward because the atmospheric or the global circulation has just more energy, so they're going to shift a little bit towards the poles. And that's what is probably changing the timing as well. It's related to this warming.
Migrating them, and that's what changes the time of when you start. I'm trying to think of this, but shouldn't we see also like a change when I'm winning things? Or to some extent?
So the question is if this migration also will shift where upwelling ends. And I think that's an excellent question because we focus a lot on when it starts. Right now, we're not seeing a big trend in when it ends, like in later in the season. But one thing that I mean, I didn't get into the details here, but one thing that it does happen is that once the winds start to relax a little bit, I mean, the water warms up very quickly, but that also affects the wind, right? Like it's a feedback system, and there's a lot of details in that. And I mean, there's a whole study on this, but I am very convinced that that also it's ending faster, or at least like more abruptly, because of this warming of the water, right? Like that warming that we're seeing in the summer and the fall, I think that is also affecting the winds. we don't see it yet in a large scale, but I'm sure that it's affecting things somehow. And it's an excellent question. It's been on my mind for a while to look at it. So maybe that will be the next thing to look at.
I've got one more question. Ian Flynn.
Oh.
Which I think,
Hi, Ian.
I think you've already answered in part. Is asking how the difference between air and sea temperature might be changing and how that could be related to essentially any of the various things that we talked about. And I think some of that here, that land has been comfortably influenced and talked about continuous question does
Mhm.
speak to that, but more specifically that data set and between any trends and that difference.
Of course, it's come from you, Ian, because some things I learned in your class, but I've forgotten a lot about of this. I have never really looked at that. I know that it definitely the air-sea difference affects, as I say, like in the once the winds relax and the water warms up fast, it definitely changes the winds, makes the atmospheric layer completely different. So we don't have the strong winds, and it's a drop that is very easily seen in the buoys, but it's not seen in the models or even in the upwelling index, for example. It's you still have predicted winds, and then actually at the coast you have nothing. I have not looked at trends of that, but it's been in my mind. I mean, I'm making signs here to Gammon because I was just telling him like we need the air temperature and see if this has been changing, because I'm very convinced that we are going to see trends in how this is changing. We have seen strong warming events in the fall that I'm sure is changing how this interaction changes, but that's a detail that I have not have time to do.
I think it's all the time we have for questions, but thank you all for coming to the talk today. Thank you, Marisol.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and